So in this video I am gonna go over the section of the syllabus called Transport in Animals, and be aware that when we say animals, the IGCSE biology here mainly talks about vertebrates. There are some differences when it gets to the other animals, but I'll get into that in a short while. Before we even get into the syllabus, I just want to take a short step back and actually talk about why we need a transport system. This is a badly drawn animal cell, just with the mitochondria and the cell core. Now, for an animal cell to function, we need a difference between the inner and the outer environment, and to have that, we need our mitochondria to produce ATP. Now, to do that, they need some things. They do need some oxygen to get into the cell, and they need some energy. Could be in the form of carbohydrates, and they need to get rid of waste products, CO2 or lactic acid. Now, if we have a very small animal, diffusion alone is enough to bring oxygen into the mitochondria and to release CO2 from it. Over a short distance, diffusion is very effective. So just the fact the mitochondria is using oxygen will make a diffusion gradient, so O2 will diffuse into the cell, and just the fact that the mitochondria is producing CO2 will make a diffusion gradient that will make CO2 diffuse out of the cell. So if you have a small animal with a large surface area compared to its body size, it might not need a transport system. But when we get to larger animals, for example like us, diffusion works very well over a short distance, but over the long distance diffusion works very slowly. So there's no way the cells inside me could live just by the O2 that diffuses over my surface. So for larger animals to function and for them to have a high metabolic rate, we do need a transport system. And that is what I'm going to talk about in this chapter. So now let's have a look at the vertebrate's circulatory system. Again, a small disclaimer, I will not be going into the circulatory systems of invertebrates, although they are mighty interesting. They are unfortunately not a part of the IGCSE syllabus. But I really encourage you to read up on them, because how spiders do it, how insects do it, how mussels do it is super interesting. But here we have a circulatory system badly drawn in a fish. Now we're gonna here to differentiate between a single circulatory system and a double circulatory system. This is a single circulatory system as we see in a fish. So we start here in the heart. The heart is a muscle that pumps, and by pump it creates pressure and forces the blood here out into the gills. In a fish gills, the blood then goes from being deoxygenated to being oxygenated, which means the hemoglobin binds with oxygen. So we get O2 in here and releases CO2, and then the oxygenated blood runs in the arteries down into the tissue, and in the tissue it runs into the small blood vessels, the capillaries. In the capillaries we release the O2 and we take in the CO2, and then the blood runs back to the heart and everything goes again in a circle. This is what we call a single circulatory system, and this is the way it works for many of what we call the more simple or primitive vertebrates. It's just something we say. They are not primitive. Fish are pretty awesome. So it's just a saying, okay? So earlier I talked about the single circulatory system, which we'll find in fish and more primitive vertebrates. As we get into the more advanced, and again this is just something we say, they're not necessarily more advanced in function, but like reptiles, birds and mammals, we find a double circulatory system. The double circulatory system does the same as a single circulatory system, but does so with a little twist. It starts the same way. Blood comes running, deoxygenated blood comes running into the heart, and from the heart it is pumped towards the respiratory surfaces, which here in this case are the lungs. In the lung we release the CO2 and take up the oxygen, so now the blood is oxygenated. Now this blood filled with oxygen, instead of going straight to the tissue, it runs back to the left side of the heart, where it gets put into the right chamber and get pushed out to the aorta, into the arteries, and here it goes into the tissue. In the tissue it releases its oxygen, takes up the CO2, now it's deoxygenated and runs back to the heart. So we have two loops here, a small loop going from the heart to lungs and back to the heart, and we have a big loop going from the heart all the way up to the tissue, to the capillaries, and back to the heart. So we've got two loops instead of one. This is a double circulatory system, and it's going to be the one we're going to focus on for the rest of the chapter. So now we get into the structure and the function of the mammalian heart. This is the main subject of the syllabus. So this is going to be where we have our focus. And I have a badly drawn figure here of a mammalian heart. We start here by the deoxygenated blood coming back from the body. It runs into the vena cava, into the right atrium. The right atrium's role is to collect the blood, and then the blood runs from the right atrium into the right ventricle. As it runs into the right ventricle, we have a valve here. The function of the valves is to allow the blood to run only one way. So the valve allows blood to run this way, but it can't run back. This is going to make a lot of sense, because the role of the right ventricle is then, with the muscular wall around it, to contract. When it contracts, it pushes the blood up and into the lungs. Now, if the valves weren't here, the blood would run back again, and then we wouldn't have the function of the heart. So the valves here are important to make sure that the blood flow to the heart, through the heart, goes in the right direction. Now, from the right ventricle here to the valve here, and then the blood runs up here, into the pulmonary artery. From the pulmonary artery, the blood runs up into the lungs, where it releases the CO2 and takes up the O2. So now we go from deoxygenated blood to oxygenated blood. Then it runs back here into the pulmonary vein. In the pulmonary vein, it runs into the left atrium. The left atrium has the same role as the right atrium to collect the blood. From the left atrium, the blood then runs into the left ventricle. The left ventricle, like the right ventricle, has a muscular wall, but actually the muscular wall of this one is even bigger, because it is going to need a lot of force to force the blood all the way through the body. From also here you have the same valves, a valve system here and a valve system here, that makes sure that the blood will flow in the right direction. Now, as the left ventricle then contracts, it pushes the blood up here to the valve and into the aorta, and from the aorta we then have blood running to the head and to the body, where eventually it will go into the capillaries, it will release its O2, pick up CO2, run back into the veins, run all the way to the vena cava, and come back through the right atrium. So all this here to the lungs and back, that is the small circuit, and from the aorta into the body and back through the veins is the large circulatory system.